Welcome to our JEDI presentation about white Christian nationalism. Good buzzword. How many people think that they have a good handle as to what it means? Kind of. We've heard it a lot since, definitely since January 6th, some a little bit before that. And Pastor used it in her sermon the other day. I don't know if you caught that in August. The other day was August, which that's the way my life is right now. When she was talking about our study of Revelations and talking about false idols. And I thought it would be an interesting topic for us to explore a little bit. But since none of us are experts, I found people who are experts that will help explore it with us. The guy on the left is one of the podcasters at Holy Post Media, which they try to break down news in a way from a Christian mindset, which I find really nice because it's not overly partisan. It's really hard to find non-overly partisan podcasts in particular these days. And then the guy on the left is Paul Miller, who wrote a book about it. So they're doing an interview, and his book was about white Christian nationalism, and we're just going to listen to a little clip of it, where he talks specifically about the definition of white Christian nationalism and the history. And then we'll have a different video, also by this Holy Post guy, that really talks about why it's a problem and why Pastor considered it adultery. So, any questions before we start? All right, and sorry about the sound thing, it's going to be a little janky, but we'll be good.
What's your working definition? Yeah, I did work really hard to be kind of careful.
Maybe on the side.
I understood it. I think it's like a fourth of the book is just defining terms. I think 3 whole chapters.
Yeah, better.
So I know a lot of people are kind of frustrated with the discourse during Christian nationalism. It's now become a buzzword, people sling it about. And so if you're looking for careful discussion of the definition, then that's what I really tried to offer here. I think that shorthand is pretty simple. If you think that America is a Christian nation and the government has a role in keeping it, I think that's Christian nationalism. There's lots of ways you can interpret the statement, America's a Christian nation. We all know the history. We all know that supermajority Americans profess Christianity. There's a lot of overlap between Christian principles and the principles of the founding. It's all true, and I affirm that and celebrate it. But it's another step further to say that our government today should have the responsibility, prerogative, the power to sustain and defend, even enforce a specific religious cultural template for the nation. That's a step beyond, and it's certainly not conservative politically. And I actually don't think the Bible gives a jurisdiction to governments to do that kind of thing. I think it's pretty clear that the church and the state have separate jurisdictions.
Okay, so you're getting into your critique of Christian nationalism a little bit, and to oversimplify your argument, you basically say that Christian nationalism is both un-American and illiberal, and it's un-Christian. So can we kind of take each of those in turn? What about Christian nationalism is contrary to the Constitution and just American values and ethics?
Yeah, so I think nationalism is inconsistent with ideas of an open society, of the Constitution and the Declaration. Nationalism is giving the government the power to say who we are as a people, rather than giving us, the people, the opportunity to figure it out and invent it on our own. And so it's really giving the government quite a lot of power. When the government does that, it inevitably excludes some people out of its definition. If you say America's a Christian nation, we got to keep it that way, what does that say to people who aren't Christians? And what does it say to kind of dissidents, people who don't fit into the mainstream Christian tradition? Mainstream Christian tradition is Anglo-Protestantism, as Daniel Huntington says. And there's nothing, my critique here isn't that Anglo-Protestantism is evil, I'm not saying that. I am saying that it's only one culture among many, many cultures in America. So if you want to take that one thing and make it all of America, well, guess what? You're actually leaving out a lot of people. And as a Christian, I think it's inhospitable, it's uncharitable to define away many of our fellow Americans. And that's the most benign way of putting it. I think we all know that there is clearly more hostile, clearly more oppressive ways that governments can exclude, disenfranchise, and oppress people on the basis of race, language, ethnicity, culture, religion, what have you. And I'm concerned that nationalism, it can start with the seemingly benign versions of exclusion and gravitate more, evolve into the more hostile versions. Yeah.
So you cited a survey early in the book that says 65% of Americans say it's fairly or very important that a citizen be a Christian to be truly American. That's a shockingly high number, 65%. And then 29%, a third of Americans say that the federal government should declare that the U.S. is a Christian nation. So these are not fringe ideas. These are not just the far right periphery.
That poll, those polling numbers, I think are about 4 or 5 years old now. I bet they're higher today.
Right.
Because of the talk about Christian nationalism, people are now really embracing the label, and I bet those numbers have probably ticked out just this year.
Okay, speaking of embracing the label, when I first started bumping into this in recent discourse, political dialogue, it seemed like Christian nationalism was being thrown out there more by people on the left as a critique or a pejorative of religious conservatives on the right. Increasingly, however, I'm hearing religious conservatives on the right embrace the label, almost like a form of linguistic jujitsu, where they're taking what was intended to be an insult and they're embracing it and celebrating it. Of course, I'm a Christian nationalist. Is that what you see happening, or are people misunderstanding this label when they apply it to themselves in a celebratory way?
I definitely see that happening, and it's a rhetorical fight over who owns the label and who gets to define its term. Frankly, they're both wrong, because you don't get to weaponize a label as an insult, nor do you get to own it as a triumphalist badge unilaterally. It actually has a scholarly meaning and a definition separate from the warring tribes. Right? Nationalism has been around for 2 centuries, and scholars have studied it for a long time, and it has a meaning separate from what the left and the right want it to mean. And when I say Christian nationalism, I'm just saying this is the particular kind or flavor of nationalism present in America today. So when people on the right brandish the label and say, well, I'm a nationalist because I love my country. Well, I'm sorry, but patriotism and nationalism are different things, and that's a kind of well-established. You can't just reinvent the meaning of words. Patriotism is good. I love my country. I have affection for it. This is my home. I'm very grateful for what a great country it is. That's patriotism. We should all be patriots. And that's very different from nationalism, which is an argument about the identity of your country. What makes up your country? What your country is? What is the national identity there? And that's where it can get exclusive and problematic.
So later on in the book, at the chapter 7 or 8, you mention how the Christian right has always included a strong focus on nationalism. And you, from your definition earlier, this belief that America is a Christian nation and that the governmental power should be used to maintain or further that, that's always been there. So what's different about what's happening now? Because I think some people would argue, if you take a time machine back to the 1980s or 1990s and the sort of Christian right activism we saw then is different somehow than what we're seeing today. And the label of Christian nationalism was not typically used in that era to describe the religious right, but a lot of people do use it today, and some of the religious right embrace it, like you said. So what's different between then and now? Or is it just a matter of degree, but the core is the same?
So I would identify 2 inflection points. One around 1965 or so, and the second one around 2016. Because you understand that the kind of political use of Christianity in America goes back to goes back to the first, the Puritan settlement of Massachusetts. Right, so this is as old as America is. And for 300 years, the controversy wasn't using Christianity for political purposes, it was which brand of Christianity. Right? Was it going to be the Puritans, or was it going to be Roger Williams? Right? Was it going to be more sectarian, or a bit more kind of Enlightenment flavored and more kind of open and less denomination? 1965 is really kind of a convenient inflection point where you can say the country had grown pluralistic enough that there were enough Americans to say, well, maybe we're not a Christian nation, or maybe we don't want to define our country that way. So those who wanted to continue defining America as a Christian nation became more partisan. It used to be a bipartisan affair. Now it is more increasingly confined just to the Republican Party. the same time it becomes more defensive, right? Previously, the sort of Christian nation advocates were very optimistic and sort of post-millennial, wanted to build the kingdom of God on earth, and it's here in America. In recent decades, it's been more defensive, more reactionary, I'd say more pessimistic, and more partisan. The next inflection point in 2016, it really becomes the central question dividing Americans politically. And where you fall on this side of the line really says a lot of your tribal loyalties and your political agenda. And so yeah, I'd say we're in a new chapter right now.
You talk at one point about the way that advocates of Christian nationalism often appeal to heritage as justification for their efforts. I'm thinking of stuff I've read and heard from people like Rod Dreher, Sumit Bamari. Their argument is essentially that democracy and liberty cannot survive without the foundations of Christianity as a cultural framework. And the progressive agenda, they would argue, is undermining the roots of our civilization. And if we don't protect it, if we don't guard this heritage, especially the Christianity in our heritage, we're going to lose the whole thing. It'll all collapse. That argument, it's kind of appealing, or at least has some traction for people, because when you do look at some of the extreme positions on the left, it does feel like there's an energy around fundamentally redefining basic assumptions, whether it's gender identity issues, marriage, the self, all those things are being redefined on the extreme left. So the extreme right comes along and says, we need to protect these things and the Christian foundations of them, or we're going to lose the entire framework for our civilization. What do you see as flawed in that argument, this argument about heritage that these voices are getting wrong?
Well, I do agree with the critique of the progressive left, and actually that is my next book. It kind of turns my attention leftward. It'll be something like The Religion of American Progress, What's Wrong with the Progressive Left? That's the working title.
You're just going to have no friends left, are you?
I don't have any now. So I agree with the concerns about the illiberality, the intellectual authoritarianism of the left. I think that's a true concern. But I think the solution, nationalism is not a solution that actually throws fuel on the fire. It is as bad as the disease it seeks to cure. And this is chapter 5 of the book, for anyone who wants to pick it up. I see a symbiotic relationship between progressives and nationalists, between kind of identity politics on the left and nationalism on the right. I think nationalism is the identity politics of the majority tribe, right, of white Christians. And identity politics is the nationalism of small groups. In other countries, at the CIA, when we analyze other countries, we just call it ethnic nationalism. That's what it is. And so here in America, we have rival nationalisms all over the place, rival identity politics all over the place. And so the right-wing version of it, trying to impose the kind of Anglo-Protestant nationalism, is divisive because we're not all Anglo-Protestants. And it is impossible to unify the country around that vision. It's like the post-liberals on the right want to put the genie back in the bottle. They want to undo the pluralization of American culture.
Right.
Well, this is not going to happen. It's impractical. It's impossible. And any effort to make it so is going to be inherently divisive and even oppressive to do so.
But isn't their agenda, you're right, they want to undo the pluralism of American culture, but they know they can't remove all of those people from American culture, but they do want to remove them from positions of influence and power in American culture. And that seems to be a satisfying enough victory for them if we can just make sure that the people wielding power are those Anglo-Protestants, then we'll be okay.
And this kind of brings us to the question, do we need Christianity for democracy to survive?
Right.
No, we don't. And there's a bit in chapter 4 on this, drawn from some broader research I've done on the roots of democracy around the world. We all know that liberal democracy or democracy and human rights, civic republicanism, did originate in its full-fleshed modern form in Anglo-Protestant England. That's a true statement. Does that mean it only works in Anglo-Protestant England? No, about half the world would disagree with that statement, because about half the world is a functioning democracy today. It varies, and we're actually in a little bit of a democratic decline rate. Mm-hmm. But when you have functioning democracies in Japan and India and Namibia and Botswana and Tuvalu and Micronesia, it strains credulity to say you have to be a Christian society. This is the same democracy. This is not true. It's factually, empirically not true. Now, I like our democracy, and I'm a Christian, and I like seeing values like justice for all honored in the public square. It's not wrong for us Christians to advocate for ourselves, for public office, and for our ideals. That's not wrong at all. But don't mistake that for enshrining a predominance of Christianity under the false assumption that that is required for American democracy to survive, because that's not true.
Yeah, what would you say, Christian?
Okay. So I hope that was enlightening. I enjoyed that part, but I'm going to play you another video that actually gets to the nugget as to why then this is an issue and why Pastor brought it up in her sermon. So it's the same guy, it's the same host, but it's much more of a informative video presentation. So, and then we'll talk about people's thoughts about this.
Can help us understand Christian nationalism.
And I don't believe me, but I promise we'll get to it. Everyone seems to be talking about Christian nationalism these days. Politicians, preachers, pundits, scholars, everyone has something to say about this issue. Some of them are proudly wearing the label, while others are writing books to denounce the movement. One book is by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. Both of them are professors of sociology. In it, they define Christian nationalism as the belief that America has been and should always be distinctively Christian from top to bottom. In its self-identity, interpretations of its own history, sacred symbols, cherished values, and public policies, and it aims to keep it this way. Now, some of you hear that and might think, that doesn't sound so bad. After all, wouldn't America be better if distinctly Christian values filled the country? But what exactly does that mean? For example, which Christian values are we talking about? There are thousands of churches and denominations in the U.S., and we're deeply divided over all kinds of stuff. Christians are split over things like gender roles, the nature of sin, the definition of marriage. Good grief, we can't even agree on how many books are in the Bible, and whether we should take Sunday or Saturday as a day of rest. And what about all of the fellow citizens around us who aren't Christians? What place do they get to have in a country that is supposed to be Christian from top to bottom? As you can tell, there are lots of questions and critiques out there about Christian nationalism, and most of them focus on how the movement is both deeply un-American and dangerously un-Christian. And we've talked about it a lot on the Holy Post. I'm including some links in the show notes below the video with the best conversations and interviews we've done on the topic. But I want to talk about something a little bit different today. I want to get to the real core problem of Christian nationalism. A core problem that I think often gets overlooked in all the details. And that brings me back to the pudding. So buckle up, a little more history here. Back in 1999, Healthy Choice Frozen Foods and Snacks launched a promotion that allowed customers to redeem barcodes from their product labels for frequent flyer miles. And a guy in California named David Phillips soon found a way to game the promotion when he realized that each individual pudding cup made by Healthy Choice had a barcode. And those pudding cups were just pennies per cup, way cheaper than their larger frozen meals. So he bought over 12,000 pudding cups wherever he could find them, and his plan worked. In the end, he earned over 1.3 million miles, the equivalent of 30 flights around the world, and a lifetime platinum status with American Airlines. And he did it all with just $3,000 worth of pudding. Now, here's the important part. David Phillips doesn't care at all about pudding. In fact, he didn't even keep the pudding. He donated it to the Salvation Army. What he really wanted were the frequent flyer miles. The pudding was just a convenient method to reach his goal. It was a means to an end. The point of all of this is that what David Phillips did to pudding is exactly what Christian nationalism does to Christ. In the end, Christian nationalism does not really care about Jesus. He's not the goal. Sure, Christian nationalists may talk a lot about God and Jesus and biblical values, just like David Phillips was all over town trying to buy pudding cups. In fact, people started calling him the pudding guy because from all appearances it looked like he was all about pudding. But underneath the surface, he had another goal in mind. Similarly, Christian nationalists may appear on the outside to be all about Christianity, with their flags and crosses and signs, but deeper down, their actual goal is not Christianity. Christianity is just a device, a tool that they use to achieve their real goal, which is about cultural and political power. They talk very little about a life with God, but a lot about all the blessings they expect to get from God for themselves and for their country. And here's the interesting part. When you actually read and listen to Christian nationalists, they don't hide this fact. They talk very openly about using Christian faith or using Christian values or using the Bible or even using Jesus to get what they really want, which is a country that looks more like themselves. For example, Stephen Wolfe says, Christian nationalism is a totality of national action, consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation as a Christian nation, and here's the key part, in order to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good in Christ. There it is, securing for itself earthly good. And very well-known Christian leader Franklin Graham puts it this way, one thing's for sure, our success as a nation depends on God. Our country can't turn its back on Him and expect His hand of blessing to continue. In that statement, the pudding cup is God. We can't turn our back on God because we won't get what we really want, which is blessings. Again, the goal is blessing from God, not God Himself. And William Wolfe offers a warning for those who will not follow Christian nationalism. He says, Christianity is the indispensable moral, cultural, social, and spiritual foundation of the United States of America. And if we utterly forget this and lose that foundation, little good will follow. There it is again, the good that will follow, the good blessings that will come from following the teachings of Jesus in our national setting. Whether it's securing earthly good for ourselves, national success and power, or the blessings of God for our country, in each of these cases and many more, it's evident that the goal of Christian nationalism is not Jesus. Instead, He is just the pudding cup. Jesus is just the means to achieve what they really want, which is a stronger, more powerful, more successful country. In America, where their tribe of conservative white evangelical Christians is in control, from top to bottom. That's how Christian nationalism makes cultural and political power into a false god. There's another popular American heresy that operates the exact same way, and it's one that you might be more familiar with, the prosperity gospel. It also simply uses Jesus. It reduces Him into a means of achieving some other goal. It says that if you worship Jesus and if you follow biblical principles, well then God will give you what you really want, success, money, health, and fame. And it's an outrageously popular message in our very religious and very consumeristic culture. But here's the difference. A lot of Christians recognize the problem with the prosperity gospel. They recognize that it's not what Jesus and His apostles preached. They get it that the goal of the Christian life isn't really supposed to be money. But when those very same prosperity formulas are applied to something other than money, somehow we lose sight of the problem. We have difficulty recognizing the heresy for which it is. Consider purity culture. The purity culture movement, or what Caitlin Beatty calls the sexual prosperity gospel, told millions of Christian teenage boys that if they remained celibate, and it told many millions of Christian teenage girls that if they remained modest, then God would reward them with fantastic marriages and satisfying sex lives. In that form of the prosperity gospel, following Christian sexual ethics is the pudding cup. The real goal is satisfying sex lives and great marriages. Or what about the Gothard movement? Bill Gothard and his ultra-fundamentalist Institute for Basic Life Principles. He taught millions of parents that if they just use his biblical principles, then their children would grow up to be obedient and godly Christians. In this case, the pudding cup is using biblical principles, but the real goal was not Jesus. The real goal was having perfect children. In a way, it was just the parenting prosperity gospel. Each of these movements looks really Christian. They look Christian because they use Christian language and they reference the Bible a lot, but in each case, the goal isn't really Jesus. Instead, he's just the pudding cup. He's just a means to get what they really want, which is money or success or a great marriage or satisfying sex or perfect kids, or, in the case of Christian nationalism, political and cultural power. Christian nationalism is just the same old American heresy, but with a new goal. It isn't what Jesus taught. It's not what the apostles preached. It's not the mission of the church we read in the New Testament. And it isn't the surrender of power that we see in the cross. It guarantees God's blessing for our whole nation if we would just put the right people in power and pass the right biblical laws. And that's why millions of American Christians are eagerly embracing Christian nationalism. But you need to remember this. Any message in which Jesus is the means but not the goal is not true Christianity. It's idolatry. And that's why Christian nationalism may claim it's trying to make America more Christian, when in fact it's doing exactly the opposite.
I like that video a lot. It was probably the clearest explanation that I've seen as to why Christian nationalism is challenging. Any thoughts on all of that? Is it enlightening? Hopefully a little enlightening. On the tables is an article. It's actually an excerpt from an article from the United Methodist Church's website. The front page has just kind of a written explanation as to what was on that first video talking about the history. And if you flip over the back, the last two questions on the back page are what can you do to help? I encourage you to read those, obviously in JEDI group. We're always looking for more people to join us and or just come and listen to our presentations so we can all be a little bit more informed. But then also there's some great organizations both here locally and nationally that are doing really good work to try to combat this. So if there's nothing else, any other questions?
What are the organizations locally?
Locally, there are branches at the ALCU here in Western Washington that, and then I would say that's a really interesting question if there's any like Bellevue, East Side based organizations that are specifically hiding.
But wouldn't there be national organizations that have people locally?
Yeah, like there's SPLC people locally. So the Southern Poverty Law Center does send people to do talks here in the Seattle area. But like boots on the ground organizations, I will have to research that and get back to you actually.
What about like Indivisible and No Kings? Is that what you're talking about or something a little different?
Those are pretty political organizations, I would say, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if you want to go on the political front of that. I think most of the fight right now is more on the political front. If you're looking though for like pure human rights organizations, I would say the ACLU and Southern Poverty Law Center are my personal go-tos. Yeah.
I think also it's called Faithful America.
Oh, the Faithful America group.
And it is
also.
Christian-centered.
Yeah.
And it's kind of calling out Christian nationalism, and they have petitions you can sign, and they do have some activities. I haven't seen anything locally, but I think on their website, we could probably look at that and maybe share it.
Yeah.
There's some on the sheet on the
Yeah, the very last question has some.
it's hard to tell where it starts.
I know, I was trying to get it all on 2 pages and not make it too small. But yeah, yes.
Just to present another view, I think he's making broad generalizations about Christian nationalists, and I know some people would be very offended by that. It's people who really follow their Bible and they don't think that our government is acting the way that God wants us to act, and they would like to see the government reformed and be more Christian and just to align with their beliefs. And I'm sure there's many people in the Christian nationalist group that would fit what he's talking about, but I think there's many who are just devout Christians and want their government to please God.
Yes, I agree there are many very good Christians who are doing good work in the government. From his definition of Christian nationalism, though, they're probably not doing it in pursuit of power, but more in pursuit of using government power in order to actually follow Jesus, which I think is a little different than his definition, at least, of what Christian nationalism
They're
is.
putting ideas very offensive and disturbing. You know,
Yeah,
if
for
you
those
want-
people
If
that
you want
do.
government to be more Christian, which I'm not in that group myself, but, you know, if it's offensive to them, I respect their beliefs.
Yeah.
I think kind of
Yeah. And then
From my perspective, I think what happens, I lived a long time in the South, and I think a lot of people who are good Christians have an ethical belief that Christian values are ethical values. And I think that's where people get caught up, is they're seeing that we have corruption in the government or this or that, and they want to see what they consider Christian values of ethics and honesty in government. And I think the messaging has gotten so good from the Christian nationalists that they're tying all that stuff together and conflating it. Because I think if you talk to Muslims, if you talk to other people of faith, true people of faith, they have the same core principles, right?
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. It is time for us to wrap, but I will also say our next JEDI presentation, which Sherry's not here, I'm not sure when that's going to be, but we're going to talk about representation in media, which will be such a fun topic too. So thanks for coming today, and I hope you all join us next time.